Welcome to another episode of the Almost Awakened podcast. I'm joined by my good friends Jana Spangler and Anthony Miller. We are on session 10 of Jack Kornfield's Buddhism for Beginners. This one was on the elements. I told Jana before we started here, Anthony, before you jumped on, that I think we finally might have one that won't go that long. But I also think still important, too, to talk about these elements. I was listening to it once through this morning, and then I was just listening to it second time. And I think there are multiple ways to kind of frame these. And I guess we could go through each one of them and see what your guys' thoughts are on each. But let's just talk about it generally. Why is Jack pointing us to the elements? Why does Buddhism make a big deal out of these? And I say elements, that's probably the wrong word. It's these forces. So there's earth, fire, water, and air. And Buddhism wants to make a big deal out of these. And before we get kind of into each of these, let's talk about why. Because I don't know that I really get that, and I kind of get that. Okay. Why are we talking about those?
So I have a couple thoughts. Buddhism isn't the only wisdom stream to kind of try to break these things down into basic elements. Some of them have 4, some 5, some 6. And I think in particular with Buddhism, there are a couple of ways that the Buddhist texts come at this. And one is as a method of elucidating the concept of suffering. So it's when we recognize that we are part of something bigger, when we recognize that we are part of nature, when we recognize that we are not just this lone creature on Earth trying to make our way all by ourselves. There's something that happens to us where we feel bigger, we feel part of something, and it tends to soften the suffering in our lives. And then the second thing that I got from this, and I think Jack spends a lot of time on this in this episode, is it's also an object of meditation. Like there's a way that it helps us observe ourselves. And, that's one of the big questions of Buddhism is, and the big mechanisms of Buddhism is looking at ourselves and what is our nature and who are we. And this offers a framework of a way to do that in meditation. So that's what I got out of it.
Yeah, in prior episodes, Bill, you've referred to these different quotes from Eckhart Tolle. One is, "You are the universe expressing itself as a human for a little while," or ultimately, "You are not a person, but a focal point where the universe is becoming conscious of itself." What an amazing miracle. Two quotes from Eckhart Tolle. My perception of those is those are a focus on our consciousness, whereas these elements, whether they're 4 or 5 elements, the 5th being space, is focusing on the physicality of the realization of what Eckhart Tolle is talking about. Like we are stardust, right? The elements that came to be so that we could exist at one point, they existed in the universe as part of the big boom and stardust, and then eventually over time these elements, these 4 or 5 elements, if you include space, that's what we are. It just integrates this idea that we are part of the universe having a conscious experience. And then I felt like as he goes through and talks about these things, he refers to birth and death as further manifestations of these elements, which when we look around ourselves and we see birth and death in nature, birth and death and the cycle and the seasons and so forth that happen with these elements, then perhaps we can exist with a greater sense of connectivity and peace, and that we're just part of this cycle for a period of time.
Yeah, I kind of like he quoted Kurt Vonnegut as saying from one of his poems that we're just mud sitting up, right? That's kind of what you're talking about with the universe.
For a period of time.
For a period of time. And aren't I lucky, Kurt Vonnegut says. I got to be lucky. I kind of felt like I was not doing so well when I look at how great God is. But then when I recognize that the rest of the mud didn't get to sit up like I did, I feel pretty good about myself.
I
Yes.
love that. Like, you guys have already hit on it, but I want to add kind of a concept to it, but I want to reiterate then what you just said, which is everywhere there is the elements. The elements make up the entire universe. Like if you look at the periodic table, that makes up everything. And yet somewhere there was earth, fire, water, air in the right proportion that suddenly the elements animated, and suddenly the animated elements became aware. And the whole point of, I think, this episode or this conversation or this session with Jack Kornfield is to remind us that we really are one with everything. And it really is amazing. Like it's like they talk about the statistical chance out in the universe that there is other conscious life. And I forget what the name of that formula is, but it essentially argues that there's no doubt statistically that somewhere out there is. And there's a piece of me that wants to push back at that and go, this planet has been around for, whatever it is, a few billion years anyway. And in this planet's existence, there have been billions and billions and probably trillions and trillions of forms of life. And whatever the magic is that makes the elements show up as consciously aware of past and future and able to plan and prepare and to think out, that didn't happen with all of them. It happened with just a handful of species. And maybe whatever it was that magically caused that to happen isn't something that can be easily recreated on other planets that do have water, earth, fire, and air in the proportion to support life. Like maybe there is something magical that happened at a moment in time, 2.8 million years ago, where human beings just suddenly became something different than the butterfly next to them. And maybe that can't be easily reproduced. And so I get the science behind it. And I want to push back and say there is something different. Jack says it at the end, and I'll probably mention it again at the end, but what a great mystery it is to be a human being. Anyway, I thought that was, like, you guys saying that reminds me of like how rare this is for us to be alive in this moment, even having a conversation that no other species on this planet could even contemplate or imagine. The first one he talks about is Earth. Any thoughts there? Anything about what are your thoughts that come up when we mention Earth?
Before he got into Earth, he gives this example. He says the practitioner begins to recognize this body of attachment in terms of that we are part of these forms of these elements. And then he says it's like a butcher that recognizes the bones and the cuts in his practice of his trade as a butcher, and recognizes that his existence matches those, whether it's the thigh or the arm or the ribs or whatnot. And in going about life and recognizing that we are just part of these elements, part of the whole, and so forth, it gives us a sense of greater connection to these elements as we recognize that we are them and they are us. And then, like Jana alluded to earlier, this then can get integrated into a meditative practice or just an increased awareness of how we connect to and are part of things. So with Earth, he talks about Earth as an element of both hardness and softness that we experience directly. We are clay, we are minerals. Like you mentioned, the poem, we're mud that gets to sit up for a while. He refers to going to Mayan ruins and seeing the mud and the bones and so forth, and refers to a poem where the question is asked, which of these bones were the king? Because in the end, all those that existed had these bones, and even the king's bones are the same as the others, and that's us too. He talks about that we're made of earth. We are bones, and even our teeth are bones. And we return to those elements, and it becomes more visible when we are born or when we pass away that we are part of the earth elements. We decompose after we die, and we become part of the earth. And he talks about this cycle where as we die, our body begins to lose strength. It's like we're squished by a great mountain, when we're buried and so forth, and we're drawn back into the earth. So I just thought that those things were interesting because, I know that I've had many conversations with people, regardless of their faith tradition, that they feel an increased sense of spirituality or connection when they're out in nature, when they have their hands in dirt, when they're among the trees, and when they're, out in the elements. And there's something about that experience that gives people a sense of connection to something that's greater than ourselves. And I think this is part of it, is this sense of connection to the earth and the clay and the mud and the minerals that we are a part of.
Yeah, absolutely. So I just came off of a 7-day silent retreat where I did a lot of meditation. And one of the things that really struck me in what Jack said about this is that when you have your eyes closed and when you are sensing into your body, there is no solid body that you can perceive. And this kind of blew my mind for a minute, but it's really true. My sense of self, of being a solid human being, comes from my sight, really. When you close your eyes and you feel into your body, you don't feel one big object. You feel these elements. You feel sensation. It's the way that we're interacting with our environment. And to me, that just kind of blew my mind. And I've spent some time since trying to sense my body as a solid object. It's hard to do. And I think that's one of the magical things of meditation. And struck when you're talking, Anthony, about, the connection that people feel in nature. I mean, this particular retreat was held just outside of Zion National Park. I mean, it's just absolutely mind-boggling beauty. And earth elements around, all of these elements around, but the earth is striking in Zion National Park. And that was actually a big part of my meditative experience was at one point taking a hike to the Upper Emerald Pools and just noticing that I was, I am in my elements, the same as all of this world around me. I just have the privilege of walking around. I can get up and move a little easier than some of these other elements around me. But I had this experience of noticing just even the symbiotic relationship, if we talk about air, between me and the trees, and I was almost reaching out to them at one point saying, hey, give me your air and I'll give you mine. This is we're sustaining one another's life. I am literally part of all of this. And there's something that happens when you start to notice, as you said, that we are literally part of a nature in a way that I think our consciousness tries to separate us. Our consciousness tries to make us something different. I don't know why it's taken me, 48 years of my life to notice that I'm actually not physically different than the physical world around me. But there is something very expansive and calming and beautiful about noticing that. So when Jack is talking about earth, he's talking about the elements. He talks about it as hardness and softness. It's not just one particular thing. We're not just talking about the earth. We're talking about when you feel the parts of our bodies, the parts of us that are hard and soft, that is what we're noticing, and that is what they are calling earth.
Yeah, these Western ideas, and it comes, I think, in some of these monotheistic religions as well, Christianity, Judaism, Islam, where, the earth is here first, and then God takes us from some other place and puts us here and breathes the breath of life into us, and the earth is our playground. And it almost, in Westernizing and in those monotheistic religions, there is often this distraction that this is this place that we're to use and utilize, and we never really get to sit with that we are it. We are the earth. And to go another direction with it, as you guys were talking about those concepts, it made me think, like, inside this body that isn't solid, that if we could get down to the microscopic level, there are entire universes inside of us where microbes and bacteria and this and that are also living, and they're not even aware they're inside of a human body. They've got their own universe and to play around in, and they're completely unaware. And so while we think like, oh, I'm a human and I'm alive and God placed me here and my job is to prove myself or go about doing tasks and meet certain requirements, it really does give us blind spots to not recognizing that there are entire processes outside of us and entire processes inside of us. I remember reading a science article. I think I mentioned this in one of the earlier episodes, but I remember reading a science article a few years back where science can now show that our organs have some degree of subconscious, I don't mean subconscious like subconscious. I mean like a subcategory of consciousness to them. And the organs are also communicating with each other in ways that we have zero control over through our brain and through our thoughts and through this consciousness that we think we're in control of ourselves. And the liver is giving messages to, that and this. And it goes way above and beyond what we've been taught to think of how the world works outside of us and the world inside of us. And I as you're pointing out, like all of these things are meditations to sit with and begin to take on different viewpoints of all of this at work. I'm mystified. I'm fascinated. And sometimes it feels a little overwhelming too. Like I don't really have a way to put all of this in order and to understand it completely. And that can also be a little frustrating.
Yeah, I'm struck by what you said there, Bill, but with what we do in Western society, and I think also in the age we live in, we do all that we can to separate ourselves from nature. We build elaborate shelters and systems to keep myself away from the elements at all times. And so it does tend to bring this idea that we are something separate. And it is all mind-boggling to kind of try to comprehend and understand. But I think as objects of meditation, these four elements actually can be very helpful. During my retreat, I went on this retreat with Thomas McConkie, who has been one of my meditation teachers, and it had some wonderful instruction on meditation and in ways to start to notice what's going on around us and our consciousness. And it just struck me how this is another way to do what I was learning a different method there. There are all kinds of different streams of methods of connecting to the world around us. But at its core, I think that my sense was that Jack is using these four things, earth, air, fire, water, as ways for us to note what is happening, what we are made up of, and notice that it's not materially different from the world around us. And what it actually does is it helps us get into a different state of consciousness and to really do what meditation is a tool and engineered to do, which is to take away that separateness, which in effect helps us with suffering in the world. And it's really helpful as you're sitting for hours. Jack I noticed at one point in this, he takes you through this, and I was just feeling it because I'm just coming off of this. But when you start to sit for a while, first you're going to notice the body and the aches and the tightness, and your body starts to settle in, and then your mind goes crazy, and you start to, your thoughts are going everywhere. And it is really helpful to have a structure like this, to break it down. Thomas McConkie was using in this particular place a way of breaking things down by senses, also just by like, this is what I'm hearing, feeling, seeing. And this is another way of doing that. It's giving me a structure of four very definite things that are easy. It's not some complex thing that I have to understand what amino acids are doing in my body. It's something very simple that I can attach to and say, oh, I'm perceiving that. That is actually earth. I'm perceiving this part of me, the blood that is moving through me, the gurgles in my stomach. This is This is the water. I'm perceiving the breath going in and out. That is the air. I'm noticing the temperature of my body, and that my body actually is a furnace generating, burning other elements and creating fire. So it's actually a very helpful technique to have something very simple this way to touch into while you're sitting there. Because, before I started doing this stuff, if someone had told me I would sit for 2 hours at a time silently doing this, I would have thought you're insane. And it seems like it should be so simple. You just sit, right? Just sit. Why do we need all these technologies? But sitting is very, very complex. Most of us, especially in the West, we can't sit for more than 5 minutes without driving ourselves absolutely insane.
Yeah. I love that, you said your body is a furnace. Like, yes, your body is creating heat in and of itself, which is a pretty amazing, like the rock isn't doing that, right? Like the rock just takes on whatever happens around it, and somehow the elements and these other things come together and produce a piece of the universe that can heat itself, which is what the universe has always done since the beginning anyway, is create ways to heat itself and cool itself. And
yeah, and absolutely. And this is, it's one thing for us to talk about it, but when you experience it sitting on the mat, there is a different thing that happens. When you breathe in through your nostrils and you notice that the air is cool, and you breathe out and suddenly the air is warm, it's a very visceral reminder of that fact that we are a furnace.
Yeah, it goes into the second one of fire, which he says, we are cooled stars. And man, there's a part of me that's really sad that my consciousness, my awareness of my chance to be on this beautiful planet in a miraculous way and to be this piece of mud sitting up, as you guys have pointed to, that I don't really get. I kind of have a kind of this non-tangible way of kind of understanding how we got to here, and whatever happens after. I was with maybe I'll do this. I was with somebody yesterday, and we were talking about. Maybe it was you when you stopped in the store. We were talking about was it us? We were talking about the future and it's unimaginable. Was this us? No, maybe not.
Maybe not.
Okay, so I don't know who this was. I had a conversation recently with somebody, and we were talking about the future and how the future is unimaginable. For instance, every time human beings sit down and try to plot out what the future could look like, when Gene Roddenberry come up with Star Trek, when they wrote the movie Back to the Future, whatever expression of what the future was going to be, we always miss the mark, right? We never know what it's going to be. And the reality is that the future is unimaginable and the past is barely imaginable. And I'm sad that I get to live out my 50, 60, 70, 80, 90 years, not really getting to know how it all came together and where it all goes, right? Like I want to know what happens to us. What happens to humans? What happens to Earth? What happens to life? And we don't. We get to just participate in this little brief moment. We are the cooled stars. We are temperature. The sun is our partner. Like this, without the sun, without temperature, without water, without air, without all these things, we aren't either. Like we needed them to be, and we needed them to be just as they are. And if they were any different, we wouldn't have been. I don't know. There's just a magic to it that I think, like, at least for me, the idea is that as we sit with all of that, as you're pointing to in terms of meditation, as we just sit with these ideas, it makes us more joyfully accepting, more inclusive of life and matter around us. Anyway, fire.
Yeah, he also refers to the heat within us also comes from burning plant and animal matter that we have taken within us, which again alludes to this relationship and connection that we have with all things, that if we didn't take in and consume plant and animal matter, eventually our fire would go away, right? So it's all this connection to all these things. The other thing that, as I was listening to this session, is Bill, you talk about the angst that, maybe we feel, and Buddhism talks about grasping and wanting and aversion and these other kind of forms of dysfunction. It seems like as we become more aware of the elements of existence and draw ourselves into the current moment, and that we are a part of all of these things and they're all interconnected, it seems to, at least for a period of time, displace on the stage of our mind these dysfunctions, because it's hard to get a lot of angst about, did I back up into a tree and scratch my vehicle or something like that, and get all upset and have angst about that when I'm considering these elements that we're talking about. It displaces it.
I don't remember if it was said earlier in one of the sessions. I remember hearing the idea from some other place. This isn't an original thought, but you talk about like us eating to be alive, like how many chickens had to die so that you could still be here? And that's just chickens, right? Like consider how much life had to pass away so that you could live out your time. And it almost is tragic, isn't it? It's almost sad. And like, is my life worth 10 chickens? Is my life worth 100 chickens? Is my life worth 1,000 chickens? How many chickens is my life worth? And again, it's that idea of being thankful and grateful that for whatever reason, you're the thing that gets to be at the top of the food chain and gets to live out a life and gets to think thoughts and wrestle with ideas and write books and do podcasts, and right? Like it is pretty marvelous.
It's marvelous, and it's a double-edged sword too, right? We probably also suffer in ways that other life on the planet or other elements that are organized in different ways maybe don't have to experience. It's hard to be human. Thomas said that several times this week. It's echoing in my head. It's hard to be human. In so many ways, it really is. One of the things about fire that I noticed is, he talked about it in these material, gross ways of this. Our bodies are a furnace, and we are cooled stars. We're sunlight congealed. All of those ways. And then he also talked about it, and I think all of these elements can be done this way. I don't think that the Buddha was necessarily just trying to explain the physicality of things, but it's also on a more subtle realm. The fire that we experience in our lives, sometimes in the form of our grasping, our fear, our anger. Like you talk about those, you feel the fire of some of that emotion and some of that experience, and how noticing the fire in those subtle ways within ourselves is also a path to freedom. Because a lot of the times those are the types of experiences that we are wanting to get away from. And if in sitting with the fire, in sitting with them, noticing it, it's how we learn to process it and let it go. Much like our bodies are processing food and creating the fire and letting it go. You can, when you can see it in a physical way and experience this as a fire element in a physical way, it also helps you process the subtle experience and emotion that we all deal with in our lives.
Yeah, you're connecting dots there that, other life on this planet hasn't had to. The other life on this planet certainly endures trauma, right? Even inanimate objects, the rock in the river stream, is getting beat upon every day. Again, I mentioned before, trees that are smaller than other trees, and one tree's blocking out its sunlight. Like there's trauma, and yet us humans have to carry the story of our trauma with us, and that is an added burden that other things maybe don't, and some other things absolutely don't have to deal with.
Absolutely. Yeah. The world is inherently violent, right? It is. It's something that we don't really want to think about or look at, but the world is inherently violent, and we're all trying to shield ourselves from that in all the ways.
Aren't we all drawn to, like when you're watching a documentary, National Geographic, and there's always these scenes that are out in the Sahara, and not just when it's the drought, but all of a sudden the water comes and now there's the drinking hole for the animals. And the rhinoceros shows up, and the lion shows up, and the alligators are in the water, and the whatever animals that look like deer that are living there are over by. And to watch all of these animals try to get their needs met, and they're just doing their job, right? And it's all tenuous. There are baby animals, and you're like, oh, don't eat the baby animal, and baby animals get eaten because they're the weaker. Like it is. I think we're all drawn to those moments where life is precarious and tenuous, and anything could happen at any moment. And then we quickly watch that for 40 minutes, and now we go back to our life and try to pretend we have control of everything, right?
Exactly.
It is crazy.
And it's one of the things that I think humans have wrestled with since we've had consciousness is how do we interact with that? We have the privilege of being a little more choiceful about how we enact violence in our world. And yet we're doing so unconsciously, right?
Yeah. We have inserted a degree of the illusion of control by somewhat stepping out of the normal food chain.
Yes.
Right. Even the idea, I think you guys mentioned this earlier in one of the sessions, even I think it was you, Anthony, that mentioned like we get to go to the grocery store and just buy ground beef. And we just go like, there's ground beef. Look at that. And if we had to sit with what our ancestors had to do to get to the point to have the meat to use, we might be a little more selective of what we kill and what we don't and how much we really need to get by. Like the actual taking of life in the moment that the life suddenly is not there might have us being a little less gluttonous, right? A little less disposable of the things that we don't eat. I don't know. Again, there's just all these concepts here that are fascinating.
For sure. And I think this is why this is one reason why I think this, Buddhism and return to nature and all of these things is so fascinating to the Western world and the Western culture right now is because we have so systematically pulled ourselves out of the food chain, pulled ourselves out of the elements. And so I don't know, this episode of Jack's Dharma talk really did get me thinking about that and being on this meditation this week. Just how much we have pulled ourselves out of that. But there is something very natural, and I think that's why we're all starved of that nature. We're all starved of that communion of the earth that birthed us. And so I really loved this episode and that reminder to pull us back to that if you're sitting in meditation in your nice house that's out of the elements, can we recognize and come back to those elements and recognize how we are not materially different?
Yeah, and things like pandemics remind us, right? That, like we're not in control. Like, I could catch this thing that I have no control of catching, and maybe I die. Oh, man. Okay, water. I don't really have many notes here. I get it. Like, again, every one of these is crucial, and any one of them in any too great of a degree of difference, and we're not. Any specific thoughts here with water? I do remember him saying, Jana, as you pointed out, the systems inside us are liquid as well. Any thoughts there from you guys?
He talks about water being the blood that flows through our veins, our tears. It's the makeup of our life. Even our eyes are balls of water. And then I wrote down this quote where he says, "For the raindrop, joy is entering the river." And which is kind of representative of many of these other elements. It's this recognition that we're part of the greater whole. And the raindrop came from the moisture that went into the clouds that then ends up going to the river and it recycles, right? And he talks about the water leaves us as we die. The water element is returning to water as we die. And talks about to feel the Tao and the fluidity of all of these things as water being part of us.
Yeah, one of the things that Jack did in this is he talks about each of these, I noticed, in kind of polarities. So water, he talked about as cohesiveness or fluidity. It's the level of how stable we are versus how fluid and moving. It's an element of movement. In fire, he talked about cool or warm. In earth, he talks about hardness and softness. And when we get to air, he talks about movement or stillness. But with water, it's cohesive or fluidity. And I think that polarities, they crop up all around us all the time, and we're dealing with that. It can be, most of us think in very dualistic ways, and sometimes that can be a useful way to connect in to any given concept. But yeah, I don't know that he spent a ton of time on the water in this episode, but it's really just the nature of things. I'm struck by all of these things: water, earth, fire, air. We wouldn't be able to live without any of them. I mean,
Right.
Water
They're
is
all
one
crucial.
of the basic, they're just absolutely crucial and makes up a giant percentage. I can't remember exactly what percentage of our body is water, but it's like 80 something percent, isn't it?
He
So
said
it's a
85.
huge, okay. Yeah. It's a huge part of our makeup.
And I think of human beings and our connection with water, of, being in a canoe or a kayak on a river, or sailing, out in the ocean. And that as human beings, we have this sense of, it's common to have a sense of connection, or even spirituality, of this connection with the water, being on the water, while recognizing that it can take us to. It's a very interesting element in our sense of connection and existence.
Mm-hmm.
Man, good stuff, you two. All right. The last one is air. And, this idea you mentioned, Jana, the stillness, that's kind of what I think. Air is the space in between all the other things. And as you point out, these four elements are not only to be thought of and meditated upon in their literal form, but they also have symbolism to them. And the idea that, for instance, when we talk about meditation, air to me is very symbolic of the space between our thoughts, right? It's that moment where nothing is present, because even though air is a thing, it to the human, not being blown by the wind, if it is just still, air feels like nothing. And so there are places to go in our head to meditate upon the nothingness, or the stillness, or the emptiness, or the spaces. And there's such a chance to kind of think about these things in so many other ways. And you guys have hit on so many of them through here. It just, again, we started off, I said, I think this is the episode that'll go short. And now here we are, 12 minutes to go. And it seems like there's such depth to this stuff that you don't even know it when you start. Anyway, that's all I've got on air, but I want to hear your guys' thoughts.
So he talks about air as the circulatory system of the planet. That were it not for air, there couldn't be life on the planet. There just would be. It wouldn't carry moisture. It wouldn't. If there wasn't wind, there wouldn't be vegetation. It's all part of the whole. But the other thing that I thought about when I thought so we've alluded to this so far, that in Western culture, a lot of these element things are treated or considered very differently. So this idea in Abrahamic religions that all these things were created for us and they are given to us and we dominate them, as opposed to us being part of them, right? It's a very, very different construct in the Abrahamic religions versus this Buddhist or Eastern thought. But one place where there is a connection is with air, because in the Abrahamic religions, breath is what life is. So Adam and Eve have breath put into them, and that is what life is. And much of the symbolism in the Hebrew Bible that it relates to God, it has to do with wind and breath and air as the manifestation of the divine. And those are some of the thoughts that came to my mind as I was listening to this section on the element of air and wind.
Good stuff.
Yeah, that reminds me of a teaching from the Living School from Richard Rohr, where he talked about that Yahweh, the name for the Hebrew God, was literally breath. And we do a meditation, the Yahweh meditation, where it is the letters are enunciated so that you can breathe the name of God. And so he'll have us do this Yahweh, Yahweh. Like you actually literally breathe the name of God. So that just made me think of that when you said that, Anthony. But yeah, I just noticed that most streams of meditation, whether it's from a yogi tradition, Buddhist tradition, contemplative Christianity tradition, all of these methods of meditation and contemplation all come down to the breath. This is like such a primary element when it comes to the discipline of contemplation and stillness. It's actually paying attention to that moving air that is moving through us, because it's such a constant anchor and and as you said, symbol of the divine and necessity for life, the most immediate necessity for life that we have. And so almost every meditation practice that I know of uses that as a primary anchor. It's one of the first things you learn is to pay attention to the breath.
Yeah. If any one of those elements were to proverbially dry up and go away, air is the first one we would notice, huh? Immediately. Yeah.
And birth is the symbolism of birth is and life is when the newborn child cries, right? And expels the air. And the symbol of death is when the breath stops. It's so enmeshed in the existence of living, of birth and death. Air is part of it.
Oh, what a great mystery being a human being is. Any concluding thoughts? And otherwise, we can wrap up here. And man, I don't know that I'll do it this week, but sometime here in the near future, when we get done with this, I want to go back and just listen to you guys again. And just some of the stuff that's come out in these sessions of you guys helping me talk about this series. I really do. Again, you can have your own beliefs about what books or podcasts that have been helpful, but I think Jack does such a good job of laying it all out in as quick of a way as possible, but in real deep depth that I just couldn't leave it by itself. Any concluding thoughts from you guys?
I'll just say, I was struck in listening to this that, the time of the Buddha, it's not as if we had nuclear science or understanding of really the deeper elemental makeup of our reality. And yet what they did have was an observation of life, the life cycle, being of birth and death and all of our elements going back to the earth. And, really all the science that we have had since adds detail to that. But really these elements, not as the most primary elements, we don't have to get that derivative of it, but they still stand. And there is this wisdom and connection to it that I really appreciate, that these pieces that still stand just from observation of what the world is and what we are, it still stands. And, nature, connection to nature has been really a very important part of my spiritual practice and spiritual awakening. And as he's talking about birth and death and everything, and as I imagine it, the further down this path I get, the more I really, really do not want to be buried in the normal Western way of having my body embalmed and preserved and stuck in a box. I really have this deep, deep desire for my elements to return into the earth and mingle with what I came from.
Yeah. And it's only an illusion anyway, right? We embalm it to make it last a couple hundred more years, maybe, parts of it.
Yep.
And yet, in the end, 1,000 years from now, it returned to the earth anyway, including maybe the box.
It takes a lot longer when you put it in the box. Right. I don't want to be in the box.
That's what I mean, though. Like, it's an illusion, too. It's just to comfort us and say, like, oh, we're going to stay in my physical form until the resurrection happens. And the reality is 1,000 years from now, that story is just as much BS as any other, right?
Yep.
Anthony.
Yeah, I just, this has been really helpful. I can tell that it's been a couple of weeks since I've listened to a session of this audiobook, as I was experiencing some angst and concern and complexity in my life, that it was just helpful to return to this. And like Jana's referring to, it's so incredibly interesting, the almost sacred nature of some of these ideas that have been around for millennia, longer than Christianity, longer even than the Abrahamic faiths and religions, that they continue to provide an enduring sacred value or a prism through which you look through and experience life. And even as science and progress continues, many of these principles are sacred to the extent that they continue to provide value going forward. And so I'm grateful to participate in these things. And I would encourage people to consider whatever meaning you attribute to the word sacred, that some of these things, to the extent that you consider them and ponder them and employ them into your life, that they are sacred, and the experiences in doing so are sacred too.
Yeah. Just to say one more thing, which is, you hit on this, Anthony, this idea that I have a concept in my mind that religion always oversteps what is known, and it lays out stories and concepts and principles, and then science comes in and says, we know more now, you were wrong again. And there's something about this Eastern wisdom that it got it right before the science could actually say it existed. And I'm really impressed by that. There's something to this Eastern tradition stuff, that the idea of it existed before the actual evidence of it could be proven. And I don't know. I don't know what to do with that other than just maybe let that hang there.
Yeah, well, it's less based on myth and more based on observation. Really, Buddhism is the whole point of it is to get to reality, right? It's to not tell ourselves the stories, to see through all of that. And nothing wrong with story and myth. It's very powerful and helpful. But I think one without the other maybe isn't complete.
There's a online group that I'm in, and this month there's an online book club where we're reading and talking about Reza Aslan's God, A Human History. And in that book, Aslan goes through and talks about the history of human beings experiencing a sense of connection and spirituality. But then over time, what we tended to do as human beings is form God in our image. So it was a from us to divinity, an attribution of characteristics of ours to nature, to divinity, to existence, to God. So we formed God in our own image, basically. And as you both were talking about these things, I think that's a difference here in this Eastern thought, is instead of human beings projecting their characteristics or attributes to the divine, to the outside, this was the opposite direction, where this wisdom came from the observance of what existed outside and then attributing that to us instead of the other way around. Very, very interesting, different perspective and development of meaning and wisdom and knowledge.
And no wonder on the former, why God would be a jealous God and a genocidal God and a homophobic God and hate left-handed people, right?
Right.
And in the latter, no wonder it would be more inclusive and accepting and loving, and realizing we're all something that's connected. So let's treat each other well and fair, and let's reduce some suffering in the world.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. What a great mystery being a human being is.
Yes.
Okay, you guys have a beautiful day, and I'm always amazed at how good these conversations are. Thank you so much. You guys are such smart people, smart humans. Thank you so much.
Love you guys.
Have a great day.
See ya.